Thanks everyone for joining me today. My first CCSBE and super excited to be here. Yesterday, a lot of interesting talks that I think culminate into some of the things I want to discuss today. And if I was going to summarize really what we're talking about today is the power of storytelling and what storytelling means for entrepreneurial identity, resilience, and well-being. Where I come from and why I'm passionate about this topic is I've been on my own journey of discovering what it's like to be an entrepreneur. I worked for 8 years at Microsoft after graduating business strategy at the University of Toronto. Microsoft was kind of like my Garden of Eden. We had endless amounts of money. We had some of the best leadership I could ask for as a young professional. And it was during a time where the economy, I entered the workforce after the 2008 recession, so I'd never experienced hard times, so to speak. That got really boring. I had a leader recognize how bored I was and told me to go out into the market and go break things. And that's when I made the leap to go work at high-paced scale-ups. And I worked at 2 software companies. One was a little bit more traditional Salesforce-y, a lot of ex-Salesforce people. We made a DevOps application. Really boring, I won't talk too much about that. And then I worked at a social media marketing company, which is as crazy as you probably might think it might be. And they were trying to do a lot of interesting things with AI, technology, and at the intersection of how do people make decisions about what they want to watch? How do people make decisions around what kind of stories are in alignment with their brand? And it was my first real deep exposure into marketing. And what I recognized was marketing really is storytelling. And the marketing starts with the story we tell ourselves. If we are a solopreneur or an entrepreneur, what we believe about ourselves is quintessential to whether or not we will find our success. And what I want to share is a little bit of a map that's been helpful to me. I'm an artist. My wife is also an artist. I enjoy storytelling. I also enjoy consuming stories. And there's a framework called the hero's journey. Scholar Joseph Campbell took a look at mythology and stories across various cultures over human history and discovered that there was an underlying pattern to how stories unfolded. Those stories are also very prominent in some of the most popular movies we watch, such as Star Wars, The Lion King, Lord of the Rings. Any story that is really this essence of being in an ordinary world, things may be going in an expected kind of way. For me, that was getting a job at Microsoft after getting my undergrad at U of T. It's like, all right, good school, good job, I'm set. Nothing needs to happen. But there's a call to adventure that happens. Sometimes that call to adventure is external. Sometimes something shakes things up and destabilizes that ordinary world. I also come from a family who's been displaced by civil war, so very much rooted in that multi-generational story of being called to go elsewhere. And in my story at Microsoft, it was being bored. It was as simple as, is this really what I want to do with the rest of my life? And then crossing the threshold is the step we take as entrepreneurs, as professionals, into the unknown, where darkness lies. And there's a real power in the symbology of darkness, which is you can't see in darkness. Think about when we're talking to one another, if somebody shares a point that's really compelling, you might say, oh, I see. Like we use that to also talk about cognition. To be unable to see is to be in a place where our usual patterns, our usual structures are not holding up. And it can be a very scary place to be. What helps navigate some of this fear is having a map. And it's important to recognize that a map is also not the territory. As I discovered this morning when I tried to find the building I was supposed to be in after looking at the map. And the challenges of entrepreneurship are varied, and they will differ for every entrepreneur. As every entrepreneur comes from a different place, starts with different preconceived notions about themselves and the environment around them. And there's also the reality that the environment we live in today it's the first time all of us have lived through right now. What worked 10 years ago doesn't necessarily work right now in the same kind of way. So we think about challenges that show up externally in terms of all of that uncertainty and those obstacles. And we also think about the internal challenges of, what will my parents think if I decide that I'm going to go start a underwater basket weaving company? Is anyone going to take me seriously? Even though that's my passion. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that help navigate that internal world. And through the conversation today, I'm hoping to take us through kind of 3 key learning objectives. One is the understanding of personal narrative and storytelling in the overall understanding of a story of an entrepreneur. Understanding burnout which is super topical if anyone was in the room just across the hall earlier today. Some good discussions around burnout and the neuroscience and physiology about that, and how we can develop resilience both in ourselves but also in those that we support. I know we're in a diverse room of both entrepreneurial educators, entrepreneur support groups, and entrepreneurs ourselves. What are the actual viable tools that help us navigate the uncertainty of being on our heroes? So just, again, to reiterate some of the both external and internal challenges that are along the path as we step into the darkness, as we as Luke Skywalker leave Tatooine and go explore the rest of the galaxy. Disruption, whether that's trade, whether that's new technology, whether that's new ways of selling. There's disruption in all avenues. The narrative that's on the news that, oh, the job market is down. Oh, people are spending less. As an entrepreneur, this can create a lot of self-doubt of like, am I making a smart decision right now by going out into this world on my own when every smart person around me is telling me that it's very hard times? Internally, it's exactly that. It's the imposter phenomena. When I first started being an entrepreneur, I first just identified as being unemployed. I would show up at networking events and be like, hi, I don't have a job and I'm looking for what I'm supposed to do, trying to figure out what it was that I was supposed to do. And I observed the reactions that gave. I got a lot of empathy. I got a lot of like, hey, let me know if I can help in any way. And candidly, I was bored with that story within like 3 weeks. And that's what caused me to start calling myself an entrepreneur. That shifted the conversation to, hey, congratulations, that's a really big leap. What made you decide to do that? What do you do? Then I had to go through what do I do? I know what I do in terms of putting it on a resume to impress an employer. That isn't necessarily how I'm going to sell a product or service. And while a lot of the things that I'd learned while in my safe space on Tatooine, helping manage Uncle Ben's farm, it was not going to help me fight Darth Vader. And the other key thing that shows up is, and I tell this to my wife all the time, I'm like, man, the exciting thing about entrepreneurs, you don't have to work for anybody. But now I'm my own boss, and my boss is kind of an asshole. What are some of the key tools we have here? And bringing it back to this idea of narrative. Number one is the narrative identity. So in my own case, this journey from unemployed to entrepreneur to now storyteller, coach, solutions architect. It's understanding ourselves at the core. Some very interesting studies around narrative identity in terms of what it means for our psychological well-being. And at its core, it's really the idea I think a lot of us are familiar with like personality tests or categories and types of people. And those can be helpful to students as they're figuring themselves up. It's like, hey, maybe you're an analytical person and you're destined to be an engineer. It makes sense. You have an engineering kind of sense of being. For others, they're artists and they're a little bit more creative, a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable. But the idea of narrative identity is that this is malleable. At any point, any one of us can decide to change the story we tell about. Most of the time when we're young, that story happens very unconsciously. There's a story we've adopted because our parents, our teachers, our guides, our friends have said good job for some things and bad job for other things. And that's kind of formed this identity of like, oh, I'm a person who fits into this lane. I used to be 300 pounds, and my mom used to tell me in order to help make me feel better when I was a kid, because I was always a chubby kid, hey, some people are smart and some people are fit, and you're just smart. And that did help me feel better in the moment, but that limiting belief about myself that I didn't have the capability to be fit because I was in the category of smart people who aren't fit, stopped me from exploring what I could do to improve my health. It wasn't until somebody pointed out to me when it was kind of this like biohacking, body hacking kind of trend that was going on a couple of years ago. I'm like, oh, this actually is science and there's smart ways to do this. There are strategies to navigating injury. There's strategies to navigating what I want to eat and when I want to eat it. And that's what reframing is. Reframing is the ability to stand back, to take presence in where we are, to notice the environment around us and notice the different adverse ways we're affected by some of these stories, and that the reality that some of our failures are not signs of our own limitations, but are really the key things we're meant to overcome. And the key things we overcome then form us into the thing that we're supposed to be. If I hadn't gone through this journey of figuring out who I was, I wouldn't be here in a room talking about the journey of figuring out who you are. And another key kind of collective example that I think is really important in the current context is this idea of entrepreneur versus the idea of a creator. And I've been taking issue with the word entrepreneur a little bit. The reality of the word entrepreneur, it's somebody who bears risk and does a very challenging thing and works for an economic benefit. And when we're talking in terms of a bank or a government, we like to talk in those kinds of ways because those are the measures that we have. But these measures remove the reality of human creativity in this equation. And the role of creator, also sometimes being called a digital entrepreneur, I think is something, there's a lot of factors here. It's not the center of my presentation, but technology, AI, the access to information makes the one-person company venture much more viable, makes this identity of a creator much more viable, and that lens on identity has a lot to do with how these individuals show up in the marketplace. I know I originally didn't want to be an entrepreneur because entrepreneurs were people who took risks, stayed up all night, drank too much coffee, and did cocaine in the workplace washrooms. I'm not that person, so therefore I'm not an entrepreneur. But maybe I'm an artist, maybe I'm a creator. On the flip side of narrative, and I think where narrative helps to combat and is really foundational, I think like some of the toolkits we talked about in the other room around somatic exercises and how to find your breath and get yourself out of a stressful situation, narrative is your toolkit almost before that happens. If your body and your nervous system is telling you to stop, you've already probably crossed the threshold of going too far into something that is not comfortable for your disposition. And new things are generally not comfortable. Our nervous system sparks fear when we're doing something new because it's new and we don't know whether the stove is hot or not. We don't know if that tiger is going to eat us or not if it's the first time we've seen it. We have to kind of expose ourselves to this. This kind of comes down to that intolerance of uncertainty. This is a skill that can be developed. This is why participation in volunteer groups and different ways of being and different clubs can be really helpful in developing entrepreneurial capacity because we find ways to bridge past the fear of the tiger into recognizing that we can actually ride the tiger. And I edited my slides to include a little bit of just a shout out to Etienne Saint-Jean, his presentation yesterday, measuring kind of the factors of stress and what he called entrepreneurial career commitment and how stress itself can be a factor in reducing one's commitment to the journey and going, you know what, maybe this isn't for me. And I also wanted to highlight ego-driven leadership as often a thing that gets highlighted in entrepreneurial culture. Like I was at Startup Canada last week and a lot of the keynotes were like, well, I just did the hard thing and hustled and grinded and didn't sleep and didn't shower and I'm the best and I'm on TV now and look how great I am. And that's not necessarily correlated with the longevity of a company. Working in environments with ego-driven leadership generally results in less engaged employees, those companies are generally less adaptable to change because an ego doesn't like to admit that it's wrong. And here we get into the first of the three toolkits I want to share, and one is humility. So humility and humble leadership is really this idea of acknowledging our limitations, acknowledging when we're outside of our comfort zone, when we don't know the answer to something. I was talking to the gentleman from Angel Investors Ontario yesterday over dinner, and he's talking about how many times he gets burned by a founder who will not do this and will just lie their way through adversity. This blows up in our faces eventually. We have to acknowledge when we're outside of our comfort zone, and generally that makes us more valued as people to collaborate with as entrepreneurs. Valuing the diversity of information. This not only comes into play in terms of the diversity, equity, and inclusion of our workplaces and who we collaborate with, given diverse experiences are shown in studies to yield to more creative results. It also expands our horizons. It's why we like stories. Stories give us the opportunity to step into an environment where we maybe never will be able to go, but when something shows up that looks like Darth Vader, we're like, oh, I know what I'm supposed to do here. Like I need to center myself and use the Force. And from this, from the individual outwards, we think about how we can bridge into our teams. And when I think about teams in the entrepreneurial context and this world of the digital creator, the team is not just those who report to you, it is the ecosystem of partners and enablers that you can deliver value through. Number two is strategies for well-being and the concept of adaptive leadership. So I like to often frame, sometimes we think about resilience and we think about a fortress or something very sturdy, but resilience really is adaptability. In our body, It's not our bones that give us resilience. If we were all bones and no muscle and sinew, we would just snap as soon as something showed up. We need to be able to be flexible and need to be able to move in ways that maybe are not the expected ways to move, and that helps us stand up in the face of adverse scenarios. And one of the key things I work with my clients with as a coach is the value of mindfulness. I've had clients come to me with their grandiose ideas of what they want to create, who they want to be, what stages they want to speak on. The first question I often ask is, what does your sleep schedule look like, and what do you do when you wake up in the morning? And the value of a mindfulness practice, whether that's meditation, whether that's reflective writing, whether that's even to some degree having a conversation with ChatGPT about what you're thinking and having it reflect back at you what is going on. All of these things are key to developing a level of self-understanding, the ability to recognize when we're under stress or operating out of fear, and therefore make decisions rooted in the wisdom of what our body is telling us. I call this the internal guidance system. I think many of us maybe have heard the expression of like the feeling in our gut, trusting our instincts. Like, we use this language colloquially, and it's beyond cognition. There's no framework, logic, etc. that can tell me why my heart feels this way when I talk to one person versus another. But if I develop the mindfulness and presence of awareness, I can get a sense of when my spidey senses are tingling. And then the third tool I wanted to share, I actually discovered this while I was preparing for this presentation, and I love this framework. I don't know if anybody's heard of this framework. Nobody else has either? Cool. What I loved about discovering this framework is many of these things, working in large corporations, we use it within like a little microcosm, like employee engagement. There's surveys for that. That is an HR best practice. It's a discovery of whether or not your employees are, excited about what they're doing. How many people do you talk to who work in corporate who are not super happy about their job, but they're like, you know what, I work with some really good people. Like, relationships mean something to us. Our emotions relating to what we're doing, being able to have fun, to just do interesting things. And I think the COVID pandemic was an interesting lens on this, where one of the things I had noticed was how much time I spent in the office, not actually working, but walking to Starbucks with my colleagues, and how actually that was great for our collaboration. It didn't look like productivity, but it built trust. It created a sense of belonging. And once COVID hit, the attempts to bring belonging in a remote-only environment, I don't know what the good answer is to that still, because I can tell you a Zoom happy hour is the last place I want to be at 5 p.m. on a Friday. And lastly, I think meaning and achievement. I think these things can kind of be related, but meaning really is the essence of what most of us are doing throughout the course of our lives. I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning, in this regard. And Frankl, as a Holocaust survivor, describes how both in himself and those that he witnessed survive were those who found meaning in very small things that helped them move from day to day, like seeing a sunrise, thinking about getting back with their loved ones when this was all over. The people who had lost their meaning were the first to succumb to the sicknesses. And there's definitely a lot going on in cognitive science that we have today that correlate the state of our vision of ourselves and our vision for the future for how well we feel and how our body physiologically develops. And achievement. We get feel-good chemicals when we complete things. There's definitely a double-edged sword here. I think tools like AI can sometimes give us a false sense of achievement of like, wow, I just wrote this whole paper. Look at me. I can now be a publisher. And it definitely triggers those feel-good chemicals in the brain that we're finishing things. I think we do need to go back to the toolkit of awareness to ask ourselves the question of, is this achievement hard-earned, or am I hacking my brain with technology? And I think social media is another way where we hack our brains and go like, wow, I'm learning so much by scrolling. So integrating these three principles comes down to the opportunity, one, to identify ourselves through practices like awareness, identify our place in the world around us, how we choose to present. And this, again, almost forms a foundation into things like marketing and branding. There's maybe multiple personas we show up. Today I'm at an entrepreneurial conference. Last week I was at a neuroscience conference. So in the neuroscience conference, I'm the most businessy guy in the room. At the entrepreneurial conference, I'm the most artistic storytelling guy in the room. and learning how to adapt to those contexts through that process of awareness and experimentation. And bringing back to Joseph Campbell, gave us this framework of the hero's journey. He talks about the ability to follow your bliss and the universe will open doors only where there were walls. And tying that back into the gut feeling, into the emotions. If we're doing something we love, if we're doing something that excites us, any kind of adversity can be overcome. If we're driving somewhere to go to a job that we do not like, sitting in traffic on the 401 is going to feel that much worse. If I'm driving to go to my favorite cafe and hang out with some of my favorite people to go do some really impactful and meaningful things for me, I will be singing songs the whole time I'm on the road. And wanting to just invite everybody in the room as you navigate your own career journeys, your personal journeys, your entrepreneurial journeys, maybe think about some of these frameworks, how they might apply, and how they might apply in how you both coach, mentor, and consult with others you come to work with. I've also shared a large amount of resources. If anybody, I'll bring up my QR code here. It'll bring you to my LinkedIn. And if you go to, it's actually ali-abbas.me is my personal portfolio site where I write a number of my ideas down. It's not Ali Abbas, it's ali-abbas.me. And this presentation is hosted through it, and also happy to send a PDF of it if anybody likes. And I think I have 5 minutes left. Would love some. It's the biggest challenge I think facing a lot of us today, particularly with the pervasiveness of social media locking itself into some of these fear points. I think one of the most dangerous stories we're telling today is the story of colonialism, capitalism, and all of the ripple effects that has, that we are separate individuals in a hostile world that have to compete with one another in order to be successful. When in reality, if we pay attention to how things work in nature, spend some time in a forest with that level of awareness, we can see that there's an interconnectedness of all things and an integrity to how systems work holistically. And part of my work is using storytelling and creativity as a pathway to recognize that interconnectedness, to recognize that story of like, oh, like it's not the world working against me. I'm working within this web, and I just need to understand where I am in that web. That's rooted in indigenous wisdom. That's rooted in a number of mythological traditions which Joseph Campbell himself was oriented around. And I think for the role of, if we're influencers, educators, whatever label we have, or even mentors, it's helping individuals who are stuck in those stories to recognize this more empowering story. Yeah. What I found really work well with my clients is this idea of fear being rooted in our response to danger. And like when we're a child, we don't necessarily know that fire is hot. Maybe our parents tell us that fire is hot, but it isn't until you burn yourself where you're like, oh, fire is hot and I should avoid it. So entrepreneurship feels like a fire we haven't touched yet, because we're like, we don't know what that burn even feels like. So the fear is, I always ground folks in like, hey, thank your nervous system for identifying that this is a new thing and that new things should be treated with respect and care. But the reality is that the growth that we need is going to involve moving through that fear. And moving through that fear, and I think there's a lot of stories of different entrepreneurs, different artists who've done this exact thing. Like the evidence in that lens qualitatively to me is pretty mounting. It's like, oh, nobody really becomes super successful by sitting comfortably in wherever they are. And from there, if there's struggle in moving through the fear, I think that's where coaching can become really helpful. Because then it's, and coaching around somatic tools, polyvagal theory, because then it's like, all right, well, how can breath work actually help me ground myself in that fear? Like even I generally struggle with presentations. Before this presentation, I could hear my heart going and doing its thing. I'm like, okay, well, this is the fear just because I haven't stretched this muscle enough. So for me, it's like finding my footing, like feeling what it's like to be in my body, and almost having it sounds almost kind of airy-fairy, but like talking to my heart, going like, all right, man, you're excited, you're pumped, that's cool. But you know that if you're this pumped, your voice is gonna stutter and it's not gonna be super great. So just like, let's save the excitement for later. And I've done that a few times now, and every time I do it, I can remember the last 5-10 times I've done it, and that it literally builds the muscle. We're building new muscles in our brain, and cognitive science shows that our brain does actually change to adapt to this. Like our brains have plasticity. And a young person should feel really empowered by how plastic their brains are relative to ours. Like as we get older, it gets less and less plastic. Cool. Thank you all.